live yet.
Yep.
Hold on. Apparently it's live already.
What
and
did
I
you
haven't
do,
even
Ben?
pressed live. I don't know.
Hold on.
Let's see what happens when I add another layer of going live. Well, doing it live. And for some reason it says Heroism and My Hero Academia with Carolyn Furlong. And it is absolutely none of those. I have no idea what's going on. Because, like, the title's completely different. What's wrong with this thing?
Yeah, sure, why not?
No, we're not talking about it. Delete. Delete forever. There we go. Test. What's wrong with this? Alright, we're good.
Me? Yeah?
No, we're starting. Welcome to the Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your ever effervescent, oh wait, no, I'm not effervescent at all, host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta. How are you doing today, Anthony?
Never been better in my life.
You say that every week. I have my doubts.
True every week.
It's true. It is true. The individual weeks might suck, but the good Lord blesses more day by day. So I've.
That's what I meant.
Yes, I'm sure. Today we are discussing horror, and to do it, I had Anthony watch a video, a very funny video, that is about a kid who married a Moomin, and it is absolutely a fantastic example of one of those shows that the second that you think about it too hard, it just falls apart, and it's actually quite horrible. Horror.
Let's be clear here. This is an anime where I would go so far as to say you don't even really need to think all that hard about it. It's just horrifying. Like, as soon as I heard the topic, I went, wow, that sounds terrible.
Yep. What is this? There we go. I'm playing World of Horror to really jam in the metaphor. It's about horror, Anthony. Imagine that.
Creative title.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm certainly not running out of ideas. Anyway, so the reason why I want to talk about this is because the difference between comedy and horror is subtle, but I believe with all my heart that Moomin is actually a horror, or that Jingai-san, or whatever it's called, is actually a horror. And the reason why I believe this is because even though it's set up as a comedy, apparently all this is just for tax breaks. Did you hear about?
I'm very confused.
Basically, they adopt these monsters into their families, and they get tax breaks, Anthony. It's not that hard to understand. Don't you worry. You just let the flesh-eating monster into your house.
Comedy horror. Here's the problem with the comedy horror distinction, the way you're saying it. Now, first off, I would agree with you. This is definitely a premise that seems like the premise for a horror. With that said, we go back to the old Digibro point that the premise is the least important part of a show. I would argue that this, in fact, could make a good comedy. The problem is that you need to focus on the right thing. Which is that, for example, if this were a show about a Moomin who married someone, and it was actually horrifying, but the comedy was either that A, nobody was reacting like it was horrifying when it clearly was, and it was intended to be, so that could be a very dark joke, But dark humor is still humor. Or B, you could have it be that like it could be like a parody of anime where, this is clearly a horrifying premise, but it's so over the top and ridiculous that nobody seems to think it's horrifying. And you really drive home all of it. But, then you're getting into, like, for example, I've argued in the past that No Game, No Life is sort of like this. Like, No Game, No Life's premise is just as horrifying, if not more so, because it's
Yep.
more realistic. But I think that No Game, No Life is actually quite funny. And I still think that. And one of the reasons I think that there's a distinction here, actually, this is a better, now that I only thought of this, like, as I was talking, and now that I think about it, it's a better comparison than I realized, because there are parallels you can make. So, in the anime No Game, No Life, the two main characters are apparently adopted because, for legal reasons, brother and sister, who are clearly in love with each other, except that the sister is like 10 and the brother is a teenager. Now, most of the time, this is an automatic avoid for any sane and moral person. However, I think that No Game, No Life manages to make the joke work, but how? I think that the answer lies in the fact that you are supposed to think that they are creepy and weird and gross. Specifically Sora. Shiro is just kind of a robot. If I was supposed to think that Sora who is the brother, by the way, if I was supposed to think that Sora wasn't a creepy weirdo, that I was supposed to like what he was doing or appreciate him or whatever, I think the story would be very different. That's not to say there aren't things about Sora that you're not supposed to appreciate. For example, his determination to make a better life for himself, his sister, and the other humans that we're supposed to like. At least on some level, even on a semi-parodical level. I don't know if that's the word. I don't think you're supposed to think his relationship with Shiro is anything but creepy or weird. It is called out by multiple characters. In contrast, and this is the big difference here, this is why that show can work and this show doesn't. This Moomin show, the I Married a Moomin. By the way, for those who don't know, a Moomin is like a mythical creature that looks like a blob thing. Who cares? It's a mythical creature. This I Married a Moomin show, which is about Moomins seeking out child brides who are actually underage males. I don't really get that, but apparently that's a thing. It does not portray that as creepy or weird. The comedy is you are in a wacky scenario, or you're in a weird scenario. The comedy is not, this is super messed up, and nobody acknowledges that. The Moomin isn't portrayed as some sort of monstrous hell creature, which is actually what it is. Like, I mean this pretty much objectively. Like, it is a monstrous hell creature that is, I don't even know what you would call it. I want to say raping children, but it's unclear if they're actually sleeping with anyone, so maybe not. Like, it is, though, kidnapping and forcing these children to marry them and grow up sexually, and this is not portrayed as the weird part. It's just portrayed as wacky. That's the difference.
Yep.
It's kind of a subtle thing, though, like you said, but, I guess it's important to know anything can be a comedy. Anything can be made funny. But portrayed correct, like, you go, no, you can't make, like, child torture or whatever funny. I mean, you could. I'm not sure if I'd recommend it. You'd be messing with the bounds of good taste, but I do think you could probably do something like that. But you would have to portray it the right way. Like, the joke would not be, oh my god, these children, look at the wacky pain that all of these children are in, or look at the horrible sexual stuff. The joke would need to be something like, these people are supremely messed up, and you're supposed to mock them for how broken and disturbed they are. Like, it's a subtle thing, and I would need to get into a very specific situation to really underline. Like, I would need to actually plot out a show like that in detail, which I have absolutely no interest in doing, by the way.
Yep.
But here's an example. Flannery O'Connor is considered a comedic writer, and she is. I think Flannery O'Connor is very funny. But Flannery O'Connor has some of the darkest stories ever written. Like, I genuinely think you can make that claim. Stories of absolute depravity, showcasing the worst that humanity has to offer. She is one of my favorite authors. I once tried, and I believe Ben read the story, I once tried to write a Flannery O'Connor-esque story, and frankly, in retrospect, I think that my biggest problem was that I did not really... It felt like I was forcing it, whereas Flannery O'Connor felt like she lived in that level.
Yep.
Yeah. Among other things, the story was flawed in a variety of ways. I would like to go back to it because I think that the core of the concept was good. But the point being that you can make these horrible things funny, because Flannery O'Connor is very funny. The story Good Country People is very funny. Even her most famous short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is an extremely funny story. You could hear Flannery O'Connor. There is a recording on YouTube, which is a gem, by the way, that this exists, of Flannery O'Connor reading the story herself to a crowd of people, and they are laughing, like, frequently throughout the story. And it's a horrifying story. Like, it's about a family that crashes into a ditch and is executed by a psychopathic serial killer. That's just the plot. I just described the plot of A Good Man is Hard to Find. And it's very funny. So, all of this is to say that the comedy-tragedy distinction, as you said, it's about the attitude you approach it, your worldview, your perspective. A lot of different things go into that distinction.
Yeah. No argument from me.
Anything to add?
No. Yes. Absolutely. So there's a certain amount of humor you can put into anything that is going on. The problem is that, like, it's hard to balance it out right. Like, the game I'm playing right now, World of Horror, is pretty scary. I'm playing through it. It's not really my speed. I'm about to be murdered by this one person with scissors, I guess. As these things go, I'm a 1980s Japanese kid in a horror movie. I'm about to be murdered by scissors, wielded by a woman. I don't know what they were up to, but I should see a psychologist about that. But then there's other funny things you can do with it, like the gag is that, like, if I ever won the lottery, I dress up like Jason Voorhees, and so what are you going to do with your money? Well, I'm going to buy the camp lake, and I'm going to finally have the legal grounds I need to murder those kids who keep having sex on my beach. Like Brian Niemeyer's pointed out, that teen promiscuity has gone up since the, Murder the Sexy Teenagers movies have gone down. And I think there's a direct correlation, and maybe even causation. But yeah, no, I try to put this, like, quiet, dry humor into everything I do, just because I think that way. The world's pretty funny to me. It's also horrible, and I do a lot of hard work, and I see a lot of misery, and all this other stuff. But to me, it's all kind of funny.
Right. The two things are not mutually exclusive, which is something that I frequently, tell people, where they go, "Why'd you post that? That's not funny. That's horrifying." And I'm like, I don't see why those, I don't know what you mean. It is horrifying. It's also very funny.
It is.
drag, the fact that we live under clown world. Clowns are funny. Uh, Now, that we're being ruled by and we're forced to submit to clowns is horrifying. But the clowns themselves, even if they don't realize it, are quite funny.
Yep.
Uh, the fact that we have like transgender drag shows, just say that in a vacuum, that we live in a society where people dress up, men dress up as women and perform drag shows in front of small children. That is both horrifying and hilarious.
Yep.
That doesn't make it not horrifying. It is sick and disturbing, and and it is an absolutely awful thing that we should do everything in our power to disturb. But you're not going to tell me it's not funny. That's what makes it funny.
Yep.
Now, as far as horror goes, it's weird because I do Pinkertons Ghost. Pinkertons Ghost is a horror series. I am notorious among the three of us as not grasping horror as naturally as you or Ken. I think I do. There are a couple of stories that I've done that I think have been very effective as horror. Specifically, I think Dark Side of the Mind was pretty effective horror. Let's see. Well, Dark Side of the Mind was my personal. As far as it's not my favorite story, but it's my favorite bit of horror that I've done.
Yeah.
Was Dark Side of the Mind, which is for people who listen to Pinkertons Ghost, this is the story where, from the perspective of my character Sean's doppelganger, as he talks about how, in an alternate universe, he had murdered Violet. I found that to be a good bit of horror when I was done with it, but it doesn't come as naturally to me. And I would have previously said that I wasn't really that big of a fan of horror, but that's not entirely true. There's certain horror that I absolutely love. Edgar Allan Poe, I'm definitely a fan of. Specifically, The Fall of the House of Usher is one of my all-time favorite stories. Havokbringer says it's spooky season already. Yeah, no,
it's getting that way.
Yeah, it's getting close, and also we have something. We have one of our bigger streams planned for next week, so we need something to fill time season. What? Who said that out loud? I didn't say that. No, no. We plan all of our shows. No, we don't.
The only
Anyway,
thing I
back to
plan
horror.
is Pinkertons Ghosts.
Back to horror though. So, going into, I am a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. The Fall of the House of Usher is one of my all-time favorite short stories. Also, maybe the scariest short story I've ever read. I was never able to really get into Lovecraft particularly, but I like several Poe stories. And in terms of horror movies, I know that Jaws is classed as a horror movie and Jurassic classed as a horror movie, but this is not to say that they're not. They definitely are, at least on some level. But I always thought of them as action movies first and foremost. The horror never really stood out to me. And they're both fantastic movies, by the way. My favorite horror movie that I like, because it's actually horror, is The Thing by John Carpenter. No question. The Thing is an incredible movie. Probably one of my all-time favorite films. And I only watched it 2 years ago or so. That was the first time that I saw the film, and I love The Thing. So, Ben, what did you think? We had this discussion in Chincoteague with Mr. John C. Wright about The Thing. I mentioned something specific to the movie, something that frustrated me. People would say that The Thing was about paranoia.
Absolutely
and my
not.
response... Yeah, and my response to that was, I don't understand this, because everybody is reacting perfectly rationally in The Thing. There is actually a shape-shifting monster that is present on the premises. So they are not being paranoid by being suspicious of everyone, they are being perfectly rational. In fact, I would argue that the main character is incredibly rational. Smart decisions throughout. I'm referring to Kirk Russell's character.
Yep.
He makes intelligent, logical, rational decisions throughout the story. I don't really see any paranoia there. John responded with something interesting. He said, people who are not science fiction writers see a story like that where there is a shape-shifting monster that can turn to everyone, and they see a metaphor for paranoia. Right?
Right.
Anybody can be anything. You don't know who to trust. And that's the metaphor. People who are science fiction fantasy writers see that and they take it at face value. So they don't see that at all.
Yep.
Uh, Now, what do you make of the thing? Do you think that John Carpenter intended the thing to be a commentary on paranoia?
Hmm. I'm gonna look up what year it was written in.
1980, I think?
No, that was the movie.
When, oh, you mean the original short story?
Yep. Let's see here. Printed in 1938. I do think that there is two levels to it. The first is that John Campbell uh, was picking up on the communism that was spreading throughout the world. And secondly, I believe that he wanted to entertain people with a good horror story.
Okay, so do you think he intended it to comment on communism?
No, I think that. So, this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit. Um, I met somebody who was interested in art and stuff like that, and we talked. And, he might be a patron, but, he was drunk, so I don't trust anything he said. But the kicker with it, for me, is that he was a first generation from the Bosnian War. And he had no idea about America, and he had many thoughts and ideas. But to me, the only thing worth writing about is the downfall of America. And that might sound very strange. It's like, Ben, you write Christian themes, you write action, and you entertain, and you do this and you do that. But the thing is that that's only kind of like the introduction. That's like the dress on the bride or whatever. In reality, I only really notice and think about the fact that American society is falling apart. It's the only thing worth thinking about. It's the only thing worth writing about as an artist. There are other things to write about: the love of God, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and more. But when it comes to, sort of social commentary, to represent what we're going through art, what we're going through is the slow decline and downfall of the culture we've lived in since we were children. I think that when art is. So, we've discussed at a very long detail that Death of the Author is bunk. I think that one of the big reasons it's bunk is not just the author's culture, ideas, how he views the world that goes into a novel, um, but rather the social issues that are going on in the author's life at that time will deeply affect them at an unconscious level. Uh, I do believe that there's a small amount of collective unconscious throughout all people who interact within a society. If a society has hope, everyone feels more hopeful. If a society has no hope, everyone feels less hopeful. You know, it's the Russian. Everything's miserable, but we've got a good dictator, sort of. So everything's great, sort of thing. It's different for every group, but it affects artists directly. I think that since the Red Scare was starting to build up, and people were not looking favorably upon communists, and they never really have en masse, um, it's there. You can make an argument. Do I think that was the main purpose of it? No. No. I think the main purpose was to write an entertaining horror story. Let's see here.
Okay. So I'm thinking this through. So we get to John W. Campbell. Now, Campbell is, or I'm sorry, not John W. Campbell. I meant to say John Carpenter. So Carpenter is a bug man. As is, by the way, John W. Campbell. I've mentioned in the past that I do not think that John W. Campbell took the ticket, and the reason I say this is
Wait,
very
why'd you
simple.
call him a bug man then?
We'll get to that. Don't worry.
Oh.
I'm getting there. The reason I don't think that John W. Sorry, I keep calling him Campbell. I mean Carpenter. John Carpenter didn't take the ticket is very simple. It's because if he took the ticket, he would have had way more hits than he had. Carpenter was never successful enough to strike me as somebody who actually took the ticket. He was too much of a legitimate artist. With that said, if you actually look at Carpenter's body of work, it is extraordinarily left-wing. The only difference between Carpenter and typical Hollywood folk is that Carpenter also has genius. Honestly, It's very similar to Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino is a bug man. If you've ever heard anything Quentin Tarantino has said, he is a nihilistic, rotten to the core, absolute garbage human being. But Quentin Tarantino has created actual art, and he has shown the ability to do that somehow working within the Hollywood system. Now, Tarantino probably took the ticket because Tarantino's gotten hits, but I'm not 100% sure. But, like, if Pulp Fiction, for example, is a story with an act that actually has an incredibly strong moral core, it does not seem like the sort of story that could have been created by somebody with, like, Quentin Tarantino, in fact. Don't get me wrong, it is in its bones a Quentin Tarantino, right?
Right.
If you watch Pulp Fiction, you can immediately tell due to the dialogue, the style, and all this, that's Quentin Tarantino. But its philosophy, it's a movie. Pulp Fiction is ultimately a movie about honor, right? It's a movie about, choosing the honorable path, even if it's dangerous, even if it goes against your culture, even if the person who you are helping, is not somebody who you should be helping or would want to help you. It doesn't matter because you are a man, right? That is what Pulp Fiction is about. That is like the opposite of what Quentin Tarantino has essentially said he loves, he loves 70s nihilistic films, you know what I mean? Now, Carpenter, I think, is in a similar place to Quentin Tarantino, in that his films and who he is, like, they don't match up. Except I think with Carpenter, one of the reasons that he hasn't been able to find the success that Tarantino did is that, in fact, they did. Let me go a step further with that. So Quentin Tarantino could create crowd-pleasing pictures because I think Quentin Tarantino saw something in, like, what the crowd wants. He wished he wanted that, right? I don't think Carpenter does, and that's always hampered him his entire career. Halloween is a great example of this. Now, Halloween, mega hit. Easily Carpenter's biggest hit. Arguably, like, really his only mega hit. He's had other hits, don't get me wrong, but, like, that's the only one that broke out in a massive way. Completely changed horror movies forever. Thing was better. But Halloween, good movie, yeah. The thing about Halloween is that if you were to ask a random person what they got out of Halloween, you would notice that the original person, the one who did not do anything with anyone, is the final girl at the end of the film, right? This is what most analysis of Halloween focuses on. John Carpenter himself has commented upon this. And he has denied that that was intent. He actually says that his intention in making the movie was almost the exact opposite of this. That his intention was that the girls who were suppressing their sexuality were the ones who were killed, and the ones who were willing to express it were the ones who survived. Now, because people did not get this in the movie, right? And now that he says it, you could see the read, I think. Like, if you look closely, I get why Carpenter would say that, but it isn't the obvious read of the film. And I think if it were clear that if Carpenter made it more clear that that's what he was trying to do, it would have been to the film's detriment. That's the sort of person who Carpenter is. There was a thing he made for, like, there was a Twilight Zone-esque show. I forget what it was called. It was newer than Twilight Zone. It didn't do very well. But he did a pro-abortion episode that was so ludicrously over the top, it was actually laughable. I know this because I did not see it, but I looked up Carpenter's filmography. Like, it was a comically pro-abortion thing. Like, it was insulting. And yet, Carpenter never did make it as big as he could have. Because Carpenter was too honest with his art to give in to the Hollywood system. So that brings us to The Thing. The Thing bombed, right? It not only bombed, the reviews of The Thing the year that it came out are, like, comically bad. I saw multiple publications calling it one of the worst films ever made at the time. Now...
Well, hold on, which film?
The Thing.
Okay.
The 1983 Thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen people calling it one of the worst films ever made. You'll find multiple reviews like this. They said, like, it's disgusting, there's no plot, the characters are terrible. Now, in retrospect, this is comical, right? Like, it's one of... It's hard to believe somebody could be that wrong. Like, it's almost as wrong as you could be, and yet people said it. So, what is that, like, what do we make of this? I think what we need to make of it, like, in terms... First off, at the time, one thing that you need to remember is that while critics were on the left, they were not controlled by the leftist media organs the way that they were today. Right?
Right.
Like, they were not controlled the way that they were today. So, I think people saw this movie, and I've seen The Thing described as nihilistic, and I am not sure if I agree. It's certainly dark, though. They saw this very graphic film that was very different than other horror movies, and they had no idea what to make of it. Yeah, and Carpenter, I think if The Thing came out today, I'm not sure if Carpenter would be allowed to make it, right? I think that was the problem. Like, The Thing was just too unique, too weird. He was basically doing what he wanted beyond the Hollywood system, and he created this masterpiece. And I don't think that The Thing would have been permitted to be made inside the regular Hollywood system. Carpenter funded it with Halloween money, right?
Yep. At least
thinking
I think so.
It would be a hit.
Yeah.
So Aaron VC said Masters of Horror was the name of the TV show that the episode was on. Yeah, that's possible. I'll have to double check.
So
Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about things as I eat my chips less than a foot from the microphone. There's a certain amount of dysfunction that's required to make good horror. Like, if you remember when me, you, and John were interacting, there was a gradient of how much terror and night and so on that we could experience. Like me, I would talk about anything. I don't really have a filter. You had some things in between, and then John, in general, tried to keep the conversation relatively clean, because we talked about quite a bit. I know that John Carpenter, has been very pro-LGBT and stuff like that. And I can't remember, I feel like you mentioned it, because this game actually requires a little bit too much brain power for me to also stream and do it. So I'll have to find something else to do next week, even though it's thematically appropriate. But essentially, this dysfunction can create better horror. But the problem, because you're outside the norm, the problem is that you have to have a grounding that sets you up for virtuous activities in life. In our case, it would be our Christianity. Because we believe in Jesus Christ, we have a grounding in hope that most people do not have. Most people just kind of live and do their thing and gain pleasure or earn money or do whatever makes them feel good. The problem is that that doesn't solve the outside life issue. In other words, eternity. It doesn't solve their problem of eternity. And so, even though these people, can create art, they cannot. They're consumed by it in the same way, right? Like it's either super pro LGBT, or it's very sexualized, or it's very sort of nihilistic, like you mentioned before. With myself, I experienced a lot of troubles when I was a kid, and I, got into some very horrific things very early on in my life, disturbingly early on. And it basically made me immune to horror for some of this stuff. I can still be startled. I can still be this or that. But if someone's like, "Are you disgusted by this?" my answer is just no. I've seen worse. I've been on 4chan. Uh, I've been on 4chan. I've seen some horrible things. A dead body that's CGI and half whatever. It's not even really real. Isn't going to do anything for me. And the reason why it's not going to do anything for me is because I've seen worse, and I've seen a lot of worse. People who see small bits of horror kind of go, "Oh, okay, there's that," but that's not the same as being able to take that step from experiencing it to into the extreme, into something that is truly horrifying. There's a Japanese film that's brought up pretty often. That's basically a guy turning into an iron monstrosity. There's a struggle snuggle scene. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in it that really, should disgust a man. But somebody made that. Multiple people made that. Like it was a movie with many different people. It required set dressing and makeup, and people willing to perform the acts as actors, and so on and so forth. Like there's enough people around who have no problem with it that you can create a whole industry around it. But the more that you separate yourself from the hope of Jesus Christ, the more ungrounded your things become, and the more they serve whatever narrative you choose.
So, yeah, and I promise what I'm about to say, even though it does not sound like it relates, will relate. I once read something that was called the bad news of the gospel, and they said, I want you to think about this for a moment. Why is the gospel known as the good news? And this was, by the way, a Christian saying this, so there is a point here. And they go, if you think about it, what does Jesus say? He says that most people, at least by a standard interpretation of the text, are going to go to hell. And while the opportunity is open for all, I'm going with the standard Christian interpretation, forgetting Calvinist interpretations, and while the opportunity is open to all, most people aren't going to end up in heaven. The way is wide that leads to destruction. There is a narrow gate. You have a chance, but let's be honest, the odds are not in most people's favor. So why is the gospel called the good news? And his answer was that it's called the good news because at the time of when the gospel came out, people were much more aware of the reality of sin than they were nowadays. The reason that sounds so shocking to us now is because we do not think of ourselves as a society, as a people worthy of hell. At the time Jesus said this, the new thing was not people might end up going to hell. It was all you have to do is follow me and you won't. That's the good news. The good news is there isn't any, there was formerly no way to, and now there is. That's the good news of the gospel. So, this relates to horror and why I think Brian Niemeyer says, and I agree with, horror has its roots in Christianity. Why? Because Christianity recognizes the bad news of the gospel as well as the good news of the gospel. There is a bad ending. It's an avoidable bad ending. It's a bad ending that all you have to do, repent, believe in the gospel, right?
Yep.
And you don't need to end up that way, but it's there. Evil exists. If you don't have an the problem is that if you reject the concept of good news, then you also kind of reject the concept of horror, right?
Yep.
There is no longer a contrast. That was Flannery O'Connor's point, going back to something I was talking about earlier. She wrote her story specifically to reach nihilists, because she said that a nihilist, if you're at the bottom of a cliff, you really don't know how far down you are unless you look up. And she saw her job as screaming into the bottom of the cliff, forcing the nihilists to look up. Now, problem with a film, so I'm going to read John Carpenter on Halloween. I found what I was talking about earlier, him talking about Halloween. Carpenter said that readings of the film as a morality play completely miss the point, adding, the one girl who is the most sexually uptight just keeps stabbing this guy with a long knife. She's the most sexually frustrated, and she's the one that killed him. Not because she's a virgin, but because all that sexually repressed energy starts coming out. She uses all those phallic symbols. So, Carpenter divorces horror from its moral roots. Now, Halloween works anyway, and it works for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons that Halloween works is that does not come across when you watch the movie. Like, at all.
Right.
The obvious read of the film is as a morality play. And frankly, that is the much stronger read of the film.
Yep.
It makes the film better if you don't read it the way that John Carpenter intends you to. So, let's take a story like The Thing. The Thing is really... I think I could sort of see why a critic wouldn't like The Thing. The Thing is a brilliant movie, but in a strange way, what is the horror part of the movie? Well, the horror part of The Thing is the monster, the grotesqueness of it, right?
Right.
But there isn't really much of a moral horror to The Thing, if that makes sense. Like, The Thing doesn't corrupt you. The Thing doesn't, it doesn't force... I guess it forces you into hard choices to an extent, but...
Yeah.
If you have a nihilistic read of the film, I think that would weaken the power of The Thing. Because then it's no longer a hard choice, is it? It's, there is no good or evil anyway, so clearly you just murder everyone. That's the way to go. And
right.
You need to have this concept of good and evil to make the choices matter. That's what horror needs, and that's why modern horror generally is really no good.
Yep.
Now, in terms of Pinkertons Ghosts, we write our horror from a Christian perspective, a very Christian perspective. The discussions that Ken, Ben, and I have had about Pinkertons Ghosts is that we see the world as, the world is explicitly, merely Christian in the Lewisian sense, right?
Yep.
It does not... there is no clear delineation between one of the denominations being correct over another, but it is recognizably Christian in nature, which is the key to the story. And I think that is a serious key to Pinkerton's Ghosts and the way that we write it.
Mm.
Uh, because at least the way that I view the story, the very centerpiece of Sean's character, like I see Sean's faith as the center to his character, as the main motivating factor behind what he does and why he does it, and whether or not he is successful as a character. And I don't mean this as successful from a meta view, I mean in story. How successful he is as a character can arguably be seen in how far he strays from his faith.
Yep.
Right? If Sean remembers that he is a Christian, that he is a Catholic specifically, because I'm a Catholic and I made Sean a Catholic to make him easier to write. There's your peek behind the curtain, friends. So many of the decisions surrounding Sean were, I'm going to need to write stories with this person, so I better make him easy to write.
Right.
Including his speaking style, his religion, things like. But anyway, so in terms of Sean, right? How successful or not he is as a character in story depends largely on how closely he adheres to his faith.
Right.
As Sean tries to... Yeah, as Sean tries to navigate the world of Pinkertons Ghosts.
Right.
I'm trying to think of how to put this. As he tries to navigate the world of Pinkertons Ghosts, whether or not he is able to successfully do so is very much dependent on, is he taking the fact that he is living in a world of evil seriously. I think that's the way to put it. Sean's whole life, right? That's how he kind of gets involved in this, is that he did not take the concept of good and evil seriously, and reality bitch slapped him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was forced to, and he decided to treat his life as if it were a world where good and evil was real. And that is necessary for the paranormal Pinkertons. And in a sense, you could say that this is why Sean was one of the 3 survivors of the Pinkerton Purge. Right?
Right.
Now, that's not to say, because Sean was never the strongest Pinkerton. He was never the strongest Pinkerton. And he also had to be, in a non-meta way, very lucky. But in a more meta sense, Sean was able to survive the Purge because Sean remained Christian at his core.
Yes.
This is clear. This is important for the horror of the story, because Sean is fighting actual evil, and he is being corrupted by actual evil, or having to avoid corruption from actual evil.
Yep.
Once the evil starts to be treated as something that's like a supernatural episode, Supernatural stopped being horrifying very early on. I mean, I know that the traditional dating of Supernatural, I've only seen like a couple episodes. The traditional dating of Supernatural is that there were 5 good seasons, as they told like a single story, and then it got bad.
Right.
But I think one of the problems with Supernatural is that they really did not know what they were doing. And it just devolved into mush as time went on. Do you have anything to add there, Ben?
I agree with you. And it's pretty careful balance for it. Explicitly, Sean's Christianity preserved him. Essentially, they underestimated him. Jackmorrow, they just couldn't find. And it's implied that the puppeteer was kind of the thing that was supposed to get him. It's part of the reason why I keep bringing it back. with Jim, it is explicitly that they expect him to fall to evil eventually, and he would be a great power for evil.
Right, and he has, to Jim's credit, lasted longer than they expected.
Yep, and there's story arcs to be had there, and that's part of the reason why I'm pretty satisfied with the writing for Pinkertons Ghost so far, is because we have it balanced out. One of the arcs that will be going into very soon is that Jack is being faced by a mix of truth and lies from demonic forces, and them telling him the truth, quote unquote the truth, enough of the truth, sends him into a tizzy. Not because they lied or they told the truth, but because they knew what information would cause him to fall. In the end, Satan did mislead Eve, but he didn't mislead Eve by saying, "Oh yeah, no, nothing will happen. No, nothing bad will happen. To you if you eat the apple." He said, "Oh, what did God really say? What did he really say? Did he say that?" He drew out a different conclusion than the clear and plain one that God set out there. And to me, that's a very clear model of how demons work. Hey, man, why stop people from taking whatever drugs they want? It's not like it hurts you. Hey, man, porn ain't that bad. It's not like it hurts you. Come on, everyone views it. Hey, man, being an alcoholic doesn't hurt you. It's one of those things where it's a denial of the consequences. Many of the paranormal Pinkertons who disappeared, many of them turned to evil or were consumed by something that they were doing under their own power, and the good ones were explicitly murdered. We see that in several cases, especially with the Mirror Mirror episode, where Sean is attacked by Alexander the Great in the Funhouse Mirror House. You can't have, like you said earlier, you can't have evil without the good potential. But if everything's evil, all it does is become depressing, nihilistic, whatever. Like Game of Thrones is kind of like that. It is a horrible universe. It is a horrible universe to live in. It's a horrible universe to experience. It's just, there's no actual good parts to it. The thing with Conan the Barbarian is that there is a clear level of pleasure and riches and gain and power to be had, and you can actually be pretty secure in it.
Also note, Robert E. Howard is actually, he is a much, I'm trying to think of how to put this. Robert E. Howard is far more wise than George R. R. Martin ever. I think that's the way to put it.
Yes. I agree with you. And there's a lot to it that people kind of just throw around without really getting it. There is what's the story? I read this story of someone who was explicitly non-Christian, and it was a horror story, and it was very weak. It just didn't have, I can't remember the name of it. It just didn't have anything to it. The character was evil. She was sleeping around. And then somebody starts murdering her friends. But there was no actual moral condemnation except murder is bad, okay? Well, the Canadian government disagrees with you. Murder ain't so bad. There's got a lot of other governments that allow euthanasia and abortion. Yeah, maybe murder ain't so bad. So, when you have that idea stuck in your head that the moral center of a story is just bogus, it ruins the ability for them to display horror. like H.P. Lovecraft, has a certain moral framework for it. He has a racial framework for it. There's a basis of civilization that he takes for granted, that he believes is the center of the universe. And abnormalities come from people not being a part of that center of the universe. And someone who's very reductivist would just go, oh, well, they're wide enough for him or something like that. But it's not that. It's the whole thing. It's the experience of Lovecraft's life and the interactions that people have with each other that he considers a certain amount of baseline as a good unto itself. Civilization. He doesn't bring up religion because I don't think he was a Christian or anything like that. And he didn't really understand it, but he knows cultic behavior and he knows, the abnormal cults out there. And he's able to contrast our normal civilization against um, the abnormality of the foreigner, the cultist, Cthulhu. Even though Cthulhu is a force of nature of a way, it's still unnatural to good humanity and how good humanity lives. Excuse me.
So, yeah, and in terms of Robert E. Howard, like, the Conan the Barbarian stories, I don't know if nihilistic is exactly the right word. Certainly,
Right.
for the most part, on that bubble. But I think that what made Robert E. Howard a master and is that in the best story, specifically, I'm thinking of Queen of the Black Coast, which I think is honestly a masterpiece and one of the greatest short stories ever written. Uh, Queen of the Black Coast is ingenious because of how it is a critique of the philosophy of Conan the Barbarian. So
Yep.
what happens in this story is that Conan essentially sums up his philosophy, which is said in a poetic way by Howard, but we're all going to die anyway. So we might as well eat, drink, and kill and what we can and live our life to the fullest. He does not say there is no afterlife, but he says the pagan equivalent, which is, we're going to be wandering as wispy shades in the asphodel fields, forever, right? The equivalent
Right.
of the asphodel fields forever.
Yep.
So, there's nothing for us in the afterlife. And his love, the pirate queen, Belit, right? Was it Belit?
Yes.
I think so, yeah. The pirate queen Belit responds that her love for Conan is so strong that even if she were to die before her time, before Conan did, she would return and save him. So, of course, this presents two contrasting views of the afterlife, and it also presents something else, which is that Belit has her own fatal weakness with greed, and it's this greed which kills her, right?
Right.
And Conan doesn't really have this. Conan doesn't care about accumulation of wealth. He cares about living, right? That's his
Yep.
goal. His goal is experience. His goal isn't, hoarding. Belit cares about hoarding in a way that Conan does not. So, the story ends, of course, with Belit returns from the afterlife and saves Conan at the last possible second. And then Conan sends off Belit in a Viking funeral, setting her ship on fire and floating it out to sea, which is an acknowledgement of Conan is wrong on multiple levels. First, he is wrong because Belit has proven that there is an afterlife and that, you can return from it. And second, Belit is wrong, second, Conan is wrong because despite him saying that he doesn't really think any of this stuff matters or means anything, he gives her a funeral. A rather lavish funeral.
Yep.
So, it is Robert E. Howard acknowledging that Conan has grown as a person as a result of his experiences here. He has learned, as Shakespeare said, that there is more to heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And that's why Howard is always going to be a much, much better storyteller than George R. R. Martin, because I don't see George R. R. Martin ever having the self-awareness to do that. He does not strike me as the type.
Yeah, and the thing with George R. R.
It would
Martin,
be fascinating, though, by the way, but
sure, but the thing is, I don't think George R. R. Martin really understands the spiritual nature of anything. Even his horror doesn't really have a spiritual nature to it. Um, with the Game of Thrones, the religions are just empty rituals, and maybe they have an old god backing them, but it doesn't really do anything for them. Maybe in the books there's something that's done for them, but in the series there's nothing. Like murders. You can murder somebody in interesting ways. If you abort enough babies, you get shadow warriors. Like it's a very basic understanding of ritual and whatnot. And even then, I don't really understand why, witches and witchery is so underused. Consider that, like, everyone has a cell phone. Everyone has a cell phone. Um, uh, everyone has a computer, more or less. Everyone tends to have a TV. You know, if something's freely available and all you need is a little study and maybe some human sacrifice, like, there's no reason why it won't become commonplace. The Druids spread like crazy. Every place has its own little religion, and a lot of it involves human sacrifice. Priests were everywhere. Pastors spread everywhere. Uh, you know, there's there's no land area where miracles can be performed. There's no land area where miracles can't be performed. Uh, like there's like in the rules provided by Game of Thrones magic system, there's no reason why, with enough blood and sweat and tears and uh, orgies, that you can't get the magical power of the gods. And the thing is that there's like, oh well, the maesters suppress it, and it's like, but they clearly don't, because the Iron Islands and other places have their magic systems. As little as it does for them. Um, and there's no point to it. Why in the world would you listen to the old man who's a little bit smarter than the average bear when you can abort a child and get a shadow warrior and kill him? And nothing will protect him. Maybe things did protect him, but George R. R. Martin doesn't go over that stuff. Like, it is a fundamentally empty and an unbreathing world. People need faith. The people always have faith, whether it's ancestor worship or a cathedral or the nature gods. There will be faith, and there will be direct prayers and requests for it. The Inuit, the Eskimo, have very explicit rituals, rites, and things that they do to ensure that they don't starve to death in the snow. That there's always snails and stuff like that for them to eat. And to their mind, it works. There's nothing like that in the worlds of many atheists and many non-believers. Like, even when they have Zeus, alive and being very amorous, there's nothing really horrifying about it, except in the sense of, oh, in the morality, that's pretty messed up. Aaron VT has a great comment. The distributist, who is pretty great. I wish I liked him more, but something about his voice, But he's good. Like, you can't go wrong listening to the distributist. Has a great video on why horror is reactionary. It's about being able to distinguish a divine limit experience from a demonic limit experience. And that's absolutely right. But the thing is that to bring it back to Game of Thrones, there is clearly plenty of divine and demonic influence running around. There is almost too much. The same with Conan the Barbarian. Conan might curse Crom, while he fights or whatever. But the thing is that it's how do I want to put it? By Crom. It's not like he doesn't believe that Crom doesn't exist. Conan believes Crom exists, but he knows that Crom's not going to do crap. But the thing is that Thoth Amon's god has given him plenty of power and rings and all this other stuff. Like it's or Belit, there's other things, kings and whatnot, mummies, invisible demons, you have your pick. In a world full of powers, there will always be religion. Does that make sense?
So, yes, I get your point. Yeah, especially, I think Tom mentioned this. One of the Song of Ice and Fire is how ludicrously little influence the priest class actually has on the behavior of people, And that's one of the problems with a lot of, think of the Middle Ages. They assume that people of the Middle Ages were like people today, where we really don't care what priests think. And I mean priests in a more general sense, by the way, just leaders, right? And in the Middle Ages, it would have just been priests, but religious leaders is my point. We really don't care what teachers think in the modern world. However, in the medieval world that A Song of Ice and Fire is supposedly based on, that is not actually the case.
Yep.
Like in medieval Europe, I think it is true to say, like, they genuinely believed in their religion. So people need to understand that this modern post-religious view of the modern world is so ahistorical. Like, there was a progression, and I know that stating it as a progression is somewhat anachronistic, but bear with me here. Like, there was a progression from, early Stone Age tribes who may or may not have started as monotheistic. I've heard multiple things from multiple sources. Not that that really matters. To a genuinely believed polytheism. Again, the reason I'm saying this, you need to be these early tribes that had multiple gods genuinely believed them. Very, very genuine. It affected their behavior. How they reacted, how they did things. It was because they believed in the god.
Yep.
And it progressed throughout history. When you get to the Christian world, they were not converting people who believed in the pagan gods, and then all of a sudden there was, the rational god. It wasn't the ridiculous pagan gods to the rational, sensical, logical Christian god that we have now progressed beyond to. We don't need any gods at all. That's not what it was. Part of the reason that the Christian god was able to work is that there was a realization that the Christian god was winning. This was a prophecy. One of the things about the early church that you see is very clear in the church fathers and early church writers is that the very fact that the church existed and spread like wildfire the way that it did was itself a fulfilled prophecy, right?
Yep.
They are very clear about this. And if you read Brant Petre's book, The Case for Jesus, which I highly recommend, by the way, he talks about this. He says one of the great reasons is that there are prophecies in the Hebrew Bible that the whole world would worship the Hebrew God. And he said, if you were to say this when the Roman Empire was in charge, you would have been laughed at. It was unthinkable. Honestly, I'm not even sure if laughed at is even right. They would have been confused. It would have been unthinkable. The very idea was ludicrous. And yet it happens. The Roman Empire converted. the Roman Empire, that
Yep.
pagan empire, converted to Christianity. So why? Well, the early church says it was in fulfillment of prophecy. And that was one of their arguments for Christianity. The very fact that they converted was itself proof of Christianity. You know, that prophecies from the Old Testament that we would all worship the Hebrew God, it came true. It came very explicitly, very directly, very unambiguously true.
Yep.
So, what I'm trying to say is, medieval man had a very robust idea of God as a very real thing that fulfilled actual prophecies in their presence, right? The fact that they
Yep.
were Christian was itself part of the fulfillment of that prophecy. They did not think of it as like a progression from paganism in the way that we think of it. It was only a progression in the sense that they now knew that this God was the God that was going to be the final God, if that makes sense. Like, there is no,
Right.
you don't conquer this God. And they saw that, right? They would kill people in the name, they would conquer these people, they would murder their followers, and it would not deter them. The reason that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, this is another thing that people don't get. Like, you don't hear this with other religions. You didn't hear this with other. You started to hear it after Christianity, but not beforehand. That's because before Christianity, blood of the martyrs being the seed of a church was almost like a contradictory statement. It
Yep.
made no sense. If you're a martyr for your faith, then your faith lost to the superior faith.
Yep.
But in Christianity, for some reason, despite the fact that they were killing the Christians, instead of that leading to the death of Christianity, it ended up converting more people.
Yep.
This would not have made sense to the pagans at the time outside of a divine explanation. That's the point I'm trying to make. It was an explicitly divine explanation, and the people at the time knew that it was divine. So, if you have a world in the Middle Ages, priest class, and again, I mean this in the general sense of religious leaders, though at the time, in the actual Middle Ages, it really did just mean priest, pretty much. I mean, more or less. Yeah, there are always exceptions. But if you have a priest class that is not listened to, you are not doing justice to the fact that for the medieval man, just like all men in all ages of history, but pretty much the 20th century, like, that's basically it in terms of when this wasn't the case, that they believed that the priests had an actual, that religion was an actual tangible thing in their lives. It was a thing where prophecies were fulfilled, miracles were performed, and you had to worship the one true God because he offered you a way out of sin. It goes back to what we were saying before. Like, the good news of the gospel was that nobody would have been surprised at the idea that most people were probably destined for hell. You get this in the pagan religions as well. And you get various answers, in Norse culture. Well, Norse culture actually didn't have a way out. It just had a temporary hold place until the end of the Greek culture, they had this concept of Elysium and heroes, but it was seen, at least in Homer, as a place that was far lesser than the joy of actually living life. The pagan religions knew that making paradise was not likely, that universalism, as we would call it nowadays, was not something that we needed, that there was no happy ending waiting for people. So they were desperately looking for a solution, and that's what Christianity offered.
Right.
And yes, Jesus warns us about the narrow gate, and he's very clear, but his point is that I am giving you the only way out. And if you miss this, then you've missed it. But it's there. You could take it.
Right.
So you get my point. That is my problem. Stories like A Song of Ice and Fire is that this very real sense of religion having an actual impact on society is lost. The Crusades were religious wars. Now, they were not only religious wars. That would be foolish to say, and I would not say that. But they were religious wars. People went for their religion. The war in Afghanistan was not a religious war. Religion was not mentioned in the justification for the war. Now, people will argue that it was, but not the same way as the Crusades. You know, the People's Crusade was a thing that rose up, and it rose up because people wanted to take Jerusalem, the holy city, from the infidels. Nobody wanted to go to Afghanistan to stop the infidel from controlling it. That was not in people's minds, but that was something that was in the minds of medieval man. So George R. R. Martin just has like a 20th century or a 21st century, really, 20 and 21st century modernist view of religion that he backdates into the Middle Ages, and it does not work. That's not how all of humanity saw it. That is an extremely recent innovation.
Yes.
That is that's all I have for my rant on that particular subject. It's why it bothers me about people like about those sorts of stories, this modernist hijacking into the past, where you take our views on religion, which are ludicrously ahistorical in the modern world, like ludicrously, and you backdate them onto literally any previous generation where it doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
And any thoughts about that, Ben?
Uh, Not particularly. You've said it pretty well. And I said what I said about religion and whatnot. And it's true that Game of Thrones has certain Christian mindsets, but it doesn't actually want to go the full whole hog into Christianity, which is what it needs. Quite frankly, hopeless worlds need hope. But the living that people have, what they do is they channel that energy into living what they would consider a virtuous life. Like when it comes to, the Scandinavians and the Greeks. I was listening to a history of them, and someone pointed out that the real golden age of the Greeks was not what we consider the golden age. Alexander or Pericles and whatnot, the 300. It was actually, 200, 400 years before, when they spent 200 years creating colonies all over the Mediterranean Sea. Because that was when their civilization was most vital, most able to spread out and conquer the lands around them, which I think is a very important mindset for this stuff. The Greeks had no real concept of horror in the same way we do. They had people who violated the laws that the gods gave to them. Sisyphus, the various monsters that Theseus killed on the way to Athens. If you're too long for the bed, he chops off your feet. If you're too short for the bed, he stretches you out on the rack until you fit it. So on and so forth. They had an element of horror to them, but it was based stacked against their laws of hospitality. And it so happens that our laws of hospitality and their laws of hospitality are pretty well connected. In Scandinavian culture, they don't really have that. I can't actually really point out a specific instance of horror that stands on its own. And this will sound pretty strange, because you're like, well, Loki had his mouth sewn shut once. Well, that's not really an element of horror. There's vengeance and fighting and doom and stuff like that. And maybe Ragnarok itself is a kind of horror, but it ends with a hopeful note that civilization will restart. Though that might be somebody's fan fiction, but who knows at this point? There's a lot of fan fiction out there and myth. Instead, what they did is that they moved forward to conquer the world as Vikings, and they spread out and out and out and out until they were all over the place, conquering, killing, replacing cultures, and so on and so forth. And similar to the Greeks, that was kind of their golden age, and it never really came back to them. The Scandinavian countries remain pretty relevant. And even when they won, or tried to win, the Great Northern War, which was a world war, or at least a supra-regional war, it was a very, very big, expansive thing, they never really became relevant again. But they defined policy for quite some time as the Normans, as the Vikings. But I can't. The point I'm getting at here is that there's special needs that need to be met within the culture, beyond even hope and religion and so on and so forth. A culture needs values, and for some reason, the Scandinavians are not as clear in their myths about their values as the Greeks are, which I find a little strange. Uh, but the Greeks wrote way more down, though. So, I suppose that's to their benefit.
Yeah, the Greeks have a weirdly, for the time, literate culture. You know,
Yep.
it's kind of funny because I have heard some people say, like, I've heard people say stuff like, oh, I don't know, I'm trying to think of how to put it. Like, we don't really know if the Iliad were the best of Greek culture. We only think this because that's what survived, and I've always thought, like, but that's not true at all. We have, like, from the time pretty much as early as anybody has ever talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, they have been revered as, like, the pinnacle of Western storytelling.
Right.
Like, that is the reason that they survived, is because everybody loved them.
Sorry about the sound there.
There is rain in the background of my house.
Oh no, like the music started playing in the game I was playing for some reason.
So we just have lots of background noise coming in. Sorry, listeners.
I've got the sound off too, which is weird.
Yeah, it's funny because we've said that horror comes from a Christian context, yet Edgar Allan Poe was certainly not a Christian. Edgar Allan Poe was a lunatic. I mean this quite seriously. If you actually ever read his thoughts on God and religion, a wild ride, let me tell you. Quite fun,
I have
though.
never thought about it before.
Yeah. Look it up one day. They're a trip. Edgar Allan Poe is such a weird man. Like, he married his 13-year-old cousin, and you want to go, oh, that is so disturbing, but, like, it is absolutely bizarre when you read all accounts of their relationship, all writing from her cousin, all writing from Poe. Like, it just seems very wholesome and healthy, yet it's not. It's disturbing.
Just like the man.
Pretty much. Look, there's certain things where, like, sometimes reputations follow off. A good example of this is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was not that weird of a, to be honest, even though that came out that way. She had health issues that made her something of a recluse, but she did have friends. I think it's really funny that she became, like, this hyper-feminist super role model when actually she was an extremely devout Christian.
Right.
Who wrote as much religious poetry as she type, although that did not become nearly as famous.
Weird.
But yeah, Emily Dickinson, like, there was this whole thing like, oh, she was obsessed with death, and it's like, no, she was just sickly and couldn't really leave her house that much. She did have friends, she had relations with people. The reason her work wasn't published was just because she didn't have an opportunity to send it out. When she did, it tended to be okay. like, at the time, and then got more popular after. Like, Poe, though, I say that, though, to preface with the fact that Poe, as far as I could tell, is about as weird as you expect a man like Edgar Allan Poe to be.
Right.
Like, he had this extremely bizarre thing where all of the women in his life somehow all died of tuberculosis. Specifically, tuberculosis. And, like, all of them. Like, his sister, mother, wife, like, everybody he ever met. Every woman he ever met, almost. Like, they all die of tuberculosis slowly in front of him. So, you can see why it might drive a man to write poems like Annabelle Lee.
I have never read Annabelle Lee.
You've never read Annabelle Lee? That's like one of... Christ.
I just don't remember it. My interest
It's
in
not that long.
poetry is recent.
It's not that long. I recommend looking it up. It's also not my favorite. Certainly better than The Bells, which I don't...
The bells, bells,
Anyway.
bells.
Yeah, exactly. Do not like that poem at all. But, anyway. Like, Poe... Yeah. First off, I'm convinced that the reason that we read Poe in school, so as anybody who knows any school system knows, there is like a genre bias, an anti-genre fiction bias. It's actually really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron VC says the Mask of the Red Death makes a lot more sense. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it all comes together. But...
Yeah,
I mean that quite seriously.
Yeah.
But anyway,
well,
going back to what I was going... Finish what you were saying.
I was just about to say, it's like, you know, as genre fiction writers, yeah, we feel it. Like, people say, like... And it's not a problem of what the people want. The people clearly have no problems buying tons of genre fiction. There are...
it's more than that. Genre fiction is preferred among the masses.
Yep. But the thing is that the elite types just don't want to publish it. And they're allergic to earning money because they serve their father Satan, and so on and so forth.
The thing is that this is like a relatively recent thing. It's kind of strange. Like, I'm convinced, so Flannery O'Connor is always like on the edge of like respected authors because she wrote Southern Gothic, you know, which is genre fiction, but it's realistic enough that you count it. She's also Catholic, and very explicitly so. Eldritch Fan says, I just tuned in. What did I miss? Nothing important. Anyway, you'll have to rewind.
Probably anyway. Nothing important.
Anyway, like Flannery O'Connor, so is always like on the edge, and if you read Flannery O'Connor's quotes about like academia, she speaks very negatively about academia, which is amusing. Like I vaguely recall some quote from Flannery O'Connor, something, and I don't remember the exact word. I'll have to, but it was something along the lines of, you know, there was a college student who said he had taken a creative writing class, and then I understood why his work was so bad. Something like that. It's pretty funny. But Poe, I am convinced the reason that Poe is permitted is because he was actually himself a part of the literati. Like, he was a literary critic who wrote reviews in literary magazines. And I am convinced that is the only reason that Poe is read in schools. Like, otherwise there is no way. It's weird how recent this anti-genre fiction bias is, though. I remember reading, so I'm a huge, huge fan of True Grit. I've watched both movies, and I eventually bought and read the book just to read it. By the way, in my opinion, the best version of True Grit is the Coen Brothers movie. I actually think it's better than the book. So there's my controversial take of the day. It's not only better than the 1960s movie, it is better than the book. But... But I read the book, which is quite good. You know, don't get me wrong. And the 60s movie is also quite good, for that matter. But when I read the book, there was a foreword to the book that I found fascinating. Once upon a time, True Grit was looked at as one of the candidates for the Great American Novel and was read in schools. Maddie Ross, specifically, the main character of True Grit, was considered to be one of the great voices in American fiction. Which she is, by the way. It is an extremely compelling, unique, and vivid voice that comes through in the novel. And yet, something happened over the years where True Grit was basically like removed from all school curricula and was completely shoved off to the side and ignored to be used as Hollywood Western by cult directors like the Coen brothers. So, what on earth happened? Now, my guess is somewhere along the lines of the schools getting even more converged than they already were. True Grit was recognized as a quintessential piece of American genre fiction. It is a Western. And it is.
Mm-hmm.
True Grit is very much a Western. I would argue that True Grit is actually a recon-decon, or a decon-recon, where it deconstructs and then reconstructs the Western. But it is a Western. So, and Westerns can't be great American literature. They are genre fiction. So, because it did not quite have the pedigree of Poe or Flannery O'Connor, it got the axe.
Yep.
It's kind of interesting. What I've had no idea that it was ever considered to be like one of the candidates for the Great American Novel. I could totally see why, having read it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't even think like it's not my favorite book. It's not even necessary, like it's definitely not. But I could see why schools would like it because Maddie Ross comes across as such a vivid protagonist. With such a clear voice.
Yep.
Like I could definitely see English teachers having a field day with it, right?
Yep.
But like it just got memory hold because it was a Western, and somehow, some way, at some point in like the 70s or 80s, they decided that the Great American Novel couldn't be a Western. Like, that's genre fiction. Maybe it's too pro-American, who knows? Or maybe it's just too quintessentially American. It's got to be more critical of America, like the Grapes of Wrath or something. So it doesn't count. Really interesting. Poe, I think, again, I am convinced, although I have no proof of this, but I'm convinced Poe gets away with this because Poe was the literati. He was actually a critic.
Yep.
And he would, by the way, get in hilarious critic wars with other writers and who would hate him. It's pretty funny. Also, I think there's also the fact too that Poe is just really, really good. Like he is on that level of quality that's almost hard to deny. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Something like I'll put it to you this way. You could argue that Edgar Allan Poe is like one of the fathers or grandfathers of like 3 different genres of fiction. I mean, you can't just even the most bug man of schools can't just totally ignore somebody with the influence of Poe. I mean, I'm sure one day if they get bad enough, they can, but not yet.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, like a lot of people don't know this, but the Mystery Writing Award is known as the because it was invented because the detective novel or the detective story was invented by Edgar Allan Poe and his Dupin stories. And he also
did it.
might have written like one of the first 3 science fiction novels with The Adventure of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. And he wrote what is generally considered by most people to be the masterpiece of Gothic horror. What's it called? The Fall of the House of Usher. So I'm reading through Eldritch Fan, who's making a bunch of comments. These days, you don't fight the monster, you become the monster and or sleep with it. Guillermo del Toro gives you a Big Lebowski style thumbs up and nod. The Death of Dr. Island by Gene Wolfe is one of the most horrifying novellas I've read. Have not read it, but I can believe that. And ever read Bradbury's Usher 2? Great riff on Poe. They even made an episode based on it on Bradbury TV show. Huh, interesting. So, I have not heard of that before, but I'll have to look it up because Bradbury is a talent.
Yep.
Ray Bradbury, Usher 2. Bradbury, Usher 2. Oh yeah, it was an episode of Ray Bradbury. Interesting. I used to say this for years, probably sometime either early school or late middle school. I wrote a story that was a riff on Poe's Mask of the Red Death, and I always said it was like the best thing I had ever written. It was like a group of kids who find something, and then the reveal at the end is castle with the Mask of the Red Death. And it was like the best thing I had ever written, and I lost never to be seen again. True tragedy. But yeah, Usher 2, huh? Interesting. And he also says I am literally rereading Hill House. Is The Haunting of Hill House what that 60s movie The Haunting was based on?
Oh, it's been done a bunch of times.
It
Uh,
has, yeah. That's
there's
like the best version of it.
Oh yeah, I rewatch it every year for Halloween.
You know, I wanted to, but nobody else in my house was interested in doing it, and I could not find like an empty room to watch it.
But it's Vincent Price.
I'm not talking. Oh no! You're thinking of the. Uh, so the Vincent Price film, I know what you're talking about, and I have seen. However, that's not the one that I'm thinking of.
Oh.
I am thinking of like there's a '60s movie called The Haunting, which is different, completely different from the Vincent Price movie. The Haunting. No, the Vincent Price movie is The House on Haunted.
There's a
And
lot
by the
of
way,
haunts.
also an excellent movie. Completely unrelated. Very good, though. I'm trying to look up The Haunting. 1960. Yeah. It is a 1963 film based on The Haunting of Hill House. The fact that there is a House on Haunted Hill horror movie and The Haunting of Hill House with multiple remakes is very funny.
Mm.
Yeah, so The Haunting is considered to be a classic film. I unfortunately have not seen it. It was remade in 1999 in an infamously terrible remake that was made by Disney. Let's see. And it won the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards Worst Picture. So there is that. Yeah, that's Shirley Jackson. So Shirley Jackson, you probably know because she wrote the story The Lottery. Now, I think that The Lottery is an awful story. Do you know about it, Ben?
No, I have no idea. I'm actually kind of um hmm. I don't know anything about it.
All right, so I'm going to describe The Lottery because you're going to find it interesting, and I have argued with people about this. I think I hate The Lottery. Now, here's what I will say. I find The Lottery to have a dark humor to it that I don't know if it's intentional or not, but probably at least somewhat. It's read in schools a lot. It was apparently very controversial when it came out, as I'm reading up on it now. The story, it's a very short story. that was first published in 1948 in the New York. And it's about there's the annual lottery is talking cheerfully about it, and then she draws her number, and then she starts complaining about the lottery, how it's really ridiculous. They don't know why they're doing it, but she learns that she lost the lottery, so they all stone her. The end. That's the whole story.
Amazing.
Uh, yeah, I hate this story, and I will tell you why. I
Yeah.
said there is absolutely no way that that this would happen, and this is why I don't like it. Like, there is no logic to the lottery. So the problem that I have, and I'm going to mean, the problem that I have with the lottery is that they don't actually have a real reason. So they say the
Mm.
local tradition is apparently practiced to ensure a good harvest. However, notably, it's just that there is a lottery and it secures a good harvest. Now, you could argue that this is analogous to, like, oh, human sacrifice is used to ensure a good harvest. But human
Right.
sacrifice is not done by picking your friend and neighbor and then
Right.
killing them. Like, your children, your friends, they would not all just turn on you immediately because you were picked in a random lottery. No, you
Right.
would go and find a stranger. You would go and defeat somebody in a war. Or you would pick very small children who nobody has gotten attached to yet. Which is why, by the way, what places like Carthage did. Why do you think it was always very young, small children who were killed? Because they had no ties with the community. Like, a random neighbor is not just going to be murdered.
Yep.
It does not make any sense. There is nothing. It is meant to make fun of small towns. It's meant to mock small town traditions, and it's meant to mock, it's implied like their names are like Tessie and Bess. It's like good old Southern boys. You know, who don't really care, and Bill, Tessie, right? Mr. Summers, Mr. Graves, small town American life. And these people are apparently such sheep that just because there is a lottery, they will murder neighbors as a result. I hate it.
Yes.
It is in the same category as Eldritch Fan says correctly, by the way, about the ones who walk away from Omaha. No
Yep.
explanation for why the kid is there, and doesn't the kid grow up? Do they have to grab a new kid every year? Right, like the problem with the ones, I mean, there's a bigger problem with the ones who walk away from Omaha. First of all, if you know anything about the con scene of that era, and I mean like the convention scene of that era, it actually becomes creepily and disturbingly obvious what is going on in the ones
Yep.
who walk away from Omaha, right? Clearly, this is a reference to people who knew what was going on at science fiction conventions, the widespread abuse of children, and did not do anything. But the worst thing about the Eldritch fan says people who you knew your whole life wouldn't all turn on you. So naive. No, I am going to push back against this, and I'm going to push back very strongly. I know what you're trying to do. However, in the real world, there is a reason for it. Now, the reason could be flimsy. The reason could be weak. The reason could be motivated by the. Also, that's number one. But number two, everybody wouldn't do it. Your closest family and friends in a small southern town, as they portrayed here, like an Americana town, no, I actually don't think that would happen. It says if you set the lottery in the big city, it would make sense. I don't even think that's necessarily true. I am not sure. What do you think, Ben?
No, they wouldn't. So there's certain things to it that's missing out. If you've lived a certain way and you haven't inculcated loyalty into your family, yeah, sure, they'll betray you for this stuff. The blood of the covenant is stronger than the water of the womb. But the thing is that it depends on how you are and who you've surrounded yourself with, and as well as sort of what you've encouraged in your own family. There's there's some things that, you can't trust your family for. Like a lot of middle class families tend to have um, if somebody does something bad, they turn them into the police. But lower and upper class families don't do that. But middle class families also take a lot more care into their children, which upper and lower class families don't do. Like there's ways you can act to make sure people won't betray you. But the thing is that like there's a story where this one guy, there was basically a bag of money fell off of an armored truck, and it was big news. It was a decent amount of money, and they asked the police chief, "Oh, you should be investigating," and he goes, "No, it'll come out in 2 days." What do you mean? We'll know who it is in 2 days. We don't have to do anything. And after 2 days, all of a sudden a tip came in. Hey, it was this guy, and they arrested him. And they said, How did you know it was going to be this guy? And he goes, well, he forgot to share out the money properly. To everyone in his family. He forgot somebody, and so they betrayed him. They got mad. And so, like, you can say that that's that, but the thing is that how far out did it have to go before, somebody was willing to betray you? In this case, it's an uncle. In another group, there's a family that had very secular institutions, and even though the dad went and they invested a lot into their children are very successful. Certain parts of the family is very money oriented. Is it a matter of treason, or is it a matter that the wrong values were inculcated in a family? And that's what it comes down to. Is your family loyal to each other? Or are they not loyal to each other? If they're not loyal to each other, you need to find better friends. You need to make sure that your friends won't betray you. But the thing is that there's not as many opportunities for betrayal as possible as you think. I don't believe anybody in the January 6th riot was outed by their family, despite what the news media said. I don't think, in many cases, family betrays people as often as people say. Maybe from the sick families, the families that are very likely to produce liberal children with no values, they betray each other. I know that my uncle hates my father. They hate each other. They don't really hate each other, but it's one of those things where they'll be fine if they never see each other again. And they've excluded me because I didn't take the clot shot. So there's these things to it, but people both overestimate and underestimate how it goes. Um, you know, it's hard to measure how much we've lost as a modern society, and we've lost an absolute immensity of stuff compared to what we could have. And the thing is that people don't want to sort of face it, or they want to just say, "Well, everyone's like this." Well, no, not everyone's like this. I know people who aren't like this. I know families who die for each other. But the thing is that like
Right.
it. Hmm?
Yeah, I guess that's what I see with the lottery. The lottery had to have been Bugman,
Yep.
and Shirley Jackson was a Bugman, and she
Yep.
is it's the sort of person who goes like, well, this is just what people are like. No, it's what the people that
Yep.
are like. Yeah,
And it's like I said earlier. People think that, oh, well, the two brothers are fighting, but in reality, my uncle David, if he had any power over me, he wouldn't hurt me. Like he just wouldn't do anything. Like it'd be apathetic, or even he'd say, "Oh, that's my nephew Ben," and they go, "Oh, he's David X's wheeler." He's his uncle. Like that would have some cachet to it. Another time, another friend had a father who he hated. Like literally, the father gave him to some nuns who would sell people to the naval perverts, the naval base, right? And Uh, he went to this guy lived a rough life, and eventually he went to prison. Now, he was treated very well, but then it was discovered that his father was a certain way. Was a crime boss essentially, not like a mafia don, but he ran bookies for across the country, and they started treating him much better. And it turns out the father didn't really have to do anything except be powerful and of this kind, and he was given many benefits because of it. Though in reality he was a model prisoner, so it's not like all that crazy. But the thing is that who you know, what you come from does affect the things around you. And it helps that if you live in a way that can take advantage of the things that happen. And many people just don't. People do not live in a way that benefits the things that they want and the things that they are doing. Um, so essentially, how do I want to put it? Being a bug man about things and being, unable to understand proper family relations. Just because we live in bad times now doesn't mean that other people in our times live it better than we do. Or in other times that it was the rule. There were times in, like, say, Athens and Rome and whatnot, where blood mattered more than anything else. There were other times where money mattered more than anything else. And it's the same way throughout history.
Yeah, and Jesus Christ is very clear about this. In fact, I don't know today's gospel that they read in the Catholic Mass was that you must hate your father, your brother, and your mother. Uh, Basically, Christ above all, right?
Right.
And I think that, and the traditional, and I agree, proper interpretation of that story is that as follows: the paradox of following Christ generally.
Mm.
Once you put Christ first, everything else follows.
Yep.
And this, though, was the radical thing that Christ was doing, right?
Right.
It was very different than, what you were saying about like Greek and Roman times and things.
Yep. It's different.
So,
Hmm?
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can finish.
It's different, for everybody. But the thing is that the more of a bug man you are, the more you think everyone else is a bug man. I accept that there are bugmen and non-bugmen. And the bugman, though, accepts that there are only bugmen. There is a video I shared on my Twitter that had this guy, the smiley, fawning, um, nice guy sort of thing, who reminded me very much of the most perverted classmate I had in high school, who, introduced a whole lot of horrible sexual things to my class and was part of the reason why we were so dysfunctional. Uh, and he goes, "Oh, BLM or LGBT?" And the guy looks at him and goes, "Neither." "Oh, you'd rather be racist and homophobic?" No, but yeah, I guess. And the guy, like, was scared. Like, he had a fear response. The bugmen cannot comprehend that there are people who are not bugmen.
Oh yeah, this happened to me. I was in a college class. This was an ethics class, and we had the abortion discussion, and I will never forget this. So first, the class was split. The majority of the class was pro-abortion, but it wasn't like a super majority. It was
Mm-hmm.
probably like 9-6 or something like that. I'm guesstimating here. And it was also very much split, not entirely, but mostly the women versus mostly the men as well. And you could guess which side was which, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they make a comment about abortion, and it was remarkable to me how little self-awareness they had. this was the comment that they made. It was something like, obviously, like people say like you could just adopt, but what if you're adopted into a bad family, or what if you're adopted into, or like what if you have to grow up in poverty or whatever, or what if you're abused? So I like heard this and I could not believe that somebody would say that. And I said like very clearly to them, like, are you trying to say that it's better to be dead than adopted? And they looked at me like I had three heads. Like nobody had ever called them out on this before. Like they could not conceive that somebody would say that. They had no response. It was like one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. Like once I brought that up to them, they could not imagine anybody just not agreeing with them immediately.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they assumed that everybody just agreed with them, that there was no like, why would you argue it? It's obvious, right?
Right.
And I've had this conversation with pro-abortion people before, where they go like, where they'll have a conversation with you, they will learn that you are pro-life, and then they'll go, "You're pro-life?" Because previously, you'll have revealed to them that you agree on some minor issue of like, taste. Right? You're having a discussion about a show you both and you're getting along. And then you reveal that you are not Bugman.
Yep.
You reveal, oh, yeah, like, for somehow it comes out that you're pro-life. And they will go, I am absolutely shocked that somebody who is not, who is as intelligent as you clearly are, could possibly not be pro-life. Like, surely only morons or evil people are pro-life. You're pro-life. Like, it just blows their minds. Because they cannot conceive of intelligent people being different than them, or thinking differently than them, or agreeing with them. Now, I can. Like, I am capable of making that distinction.
Yep.
Like, I know, there are intelligent people I know who are smart.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that we can, but I am an adult. I am a rational human being. I am capable of understanding there are people who will disagree with me on things I even think are incredibly important. That does not necessarily make them morons, but they are literally incapable of it. They can't think that. It breaks their worldview. Their
Yep.
minds break.
Yep.
It's kind of fascinating.
Hmm.
And like I have seen it in real life. Like I have actually watched people like with comical jaw drops, like that you would dare to question them on these things. They just the concept never occurs to them. Because
Yep.
this is not what good people do, and I'm clearly an intelligent person. Like, why would I say this?
You're supposed to be part of the crew, part of the smart people, that sort of thing. And people just don't. People just
Now,
don't
it
get it.
didn't help that in this ethics class, I happened to hold. I have mentioned to you before. There are two positions that I hold that in the modern world would be considered left wing, even though I don't necessarily think that's true. First is that I am in favor of student loan forgiveness, and second of all, I am against the dropping of the atomic bomb, and the atomic bomb and being against the dropping of the atomic bombs especially got identified with like the hippie movement and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So once they heard that, I think they especially assumed that I must be left wing, when like I justify it on extremely uh Thomistic and Christian grounds, and they justify it off of vague hippy dippy, like America was evil and they murdered people. Whereas I look at it as like a grim moral choice that where Aslan is not a tame lion. Yes, it would lead to a lot of death, but like that doesn't mean that we could do it. However, they don't hear any of that part of it. They just hear, oh, so you're against the too. Good, so you're one of the good guys.
Right.
Which made it all the more shocking when I was like, no, I think Christians. It's
Yep.
fascinating. So, anything you want to say before we go, Ben?
Uh, no, you've said things pretty well. we've roved around, but we needed to start somewhere with horror. And I think that one of the things that people will sort of like start realizing going forward is that you cannot just have whatever morality you want. And I think that's going to be much more important for people in the future as well. You can't just have whatever morality you want. You might think that you can. You might think that you're getting away with it, but you're not. And you will live in a more and more miserable life until it finally either dawns on you or it's too late. But at no point will your pleasure grow greater. At no point will your life grow more full, more wonderful. Instead, it is a slow march down to hell. But don't worry, you'll get that new car, that new Subaru, that whatever you want. You want those dress, that heels, that respect, that job. Oh, you can get it. It's there for you. The lies of the enemy are lies, but there's a hint of truth to them. But not enough. And death always creeps up closer and closer. There it is, upon the stair. It is putting one hand upon your car, because it's a nice car. Death is actually impressed by your car. And then he walks to the door, step by step. Your coughing is getting worse. You've been having that cough for a while. Oh, it's bad. There's a little bit of blood when you cough. Oh no. You hear death knock, and then he tries the door knob. You swear you've locked the door, but no, he opens it and he closes it respectfully. And he comes up the stairs, step by step. You hear the tap of his scythe upon each step. Step, step tap, step, step tap. And then he's at your door. Your bedroom door as you're coughing fit to die. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us this week. Come back next week where we talk about the Council of Trent. And I hope you enjoyed everything you heard here. Have a good one.